The man dragged her by the hair through the dust of the dying town. Her name was Lena, and the breath rattled in her lungs like pebbles in a tin can. Her knuckles were white where she clawed at his wrist, a futile gesture against the brute strength of Silas, her late husband's brother. He was a man made of greed and gristle, and he believed her husband's land, now hers, held a secret vein of silver. He wanted it. He would have it. The townsfolk watched from the shadowed doorways of their clapboard storefronts, their faces blank as worn coins. No one moved. No one spoke. Fear was a currency more valuable than silver. But two sets of eyes, identical in their fierce, blue clarity, watched from the alley between the smithy and the shuttered bakery. Samuel and David, her boys, her twins. They were 7 years old and had not spoken a word since they'd watched their father cough his last breath into a blood-stained rag 2 months prior. Now they watched their mother be degraded, their small bodies rigid with a horror that was ancient and absolute. Silas yanked her again, her scalp screaming in protest. He leaned down, his voice a foul whisper of rotgut whiskey and malice. "You'll sign the deed, Lena, or I'll drag you to the magistrate in the next county and swear you've lost your mind to grief." He smiled, showing teeth like yellowed corn kernels. In the alley, David's hand found Samuel's. Their fingers locked together, a single circuit of shared thought. They looked at their mother, then at each other. There was no need for words. A vow passed between them, silent and unbreakable, forged in the crucible of their powerlessness. "You're coming with us." As Silas paused to catch his breath, preparing to haul her toward the stables where his horse was tied, a rock sailed out of the alley. It was small, but it struck him square on the temple with surprising force. He swore, stumbling, his grip on Lena's hair loosening for a single vital second. It was all she needed. She scrambled away, kicking up dust, her body a blur of desperation. The twins were already moving, two small wraiths darting from the shadows. They grabbed her hands, their grips shockingly strong, and pulled her not toward the empty shell of their home, but away, toward the vast, unforgiving plains that stretched west. They ran. They ran without looking back, the shouts of Silas fading behind them into the oppressive silence of the empty landscape. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer. Lena's feet bled. The boys never faltered, their faces set with a grim purpose that belied their years. They were leading her somewhere. They had a destination. Hours bled into a day, the sun giving way to a cold, star-dusted night. They huddled together for warmth behind a rock outcropping, sharing the last stale biscuit from Lena's pocket. They ran again at dawn. By the second afternoon, Lena was seeing spots in the endless expanse of brown and gray. Just as her legs were about to give out, Samuel pointed. On the horizon, nestled against the foot of a jagged, pine-stubbled rise, was a cabin. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a fragile signal of life in a world of death. This was their destination, a refuge, or another kind of danger. The man, Elias, was splitting wood when he saw them. He was a statue of a man, broad in the shoulder and weathered by a solitude so profound it seemed to have seeped into his bones. His axe rose and fell with a rhythm that was both powerful and weary, each strike a punctuation mark in a long, silent sentence of grief. A simple wooden cross stood on a small hillock behind the cabin, stark against the sky. He stopped, the axe held loose in his hand, as the woman and the two small boys staggered onto his property. They looked like ghosts blown in by a cruel wind. The woman was bruised, her dress torn, her hair a wild tangle of dust and pain. The boys clung to her, their eyes enormous in their thin faces, fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. He didn't want them here. This place was his penance, his monastery of regret. The silence was his prayer. "Keep moving," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. Lena stopped, her chest heaving. She looked at the cabin, the smoke, the promise of water and shelter. She looked at her sons, their small faces trusting her to save them. Then she looked back at him, and he saw no pleading in her eyes, only a deep, defiant exhaustion. She simply shook her head, a small, stubborn movement. She could go no further. He saw the raw scrapes on her feet. He saw the dark mark on her temple. He saw the way the boys flanked her, like loyal sentinels. He let out a harsh sigh that turned to steam in the cooling air. His gaze flickered to the wooden cross on the hill. Sarah would have never turned them away. The thought was an unwelcome guest. "There's a well," he grunted, gesturing with the axe. "And a trough for the horse. Water's clean." He turned and went back to his woodpile, splitting logs with a renewed, violent force, as if trying to chop his own reluctant compassion into manageable pieces. He was not a savior. He was a man hiding from his own ghosts. He did not need more to haunt him. That night they slept in the barn. Elias had left a bucket of water, a loaf of dense, dark bread, and 3 worn blankets on a pile of clean hay. He hadn't spoken another word. Lena washed the dust from her children's faces, their bodies trembling from fatigue. She tore a strip from her petticoat to clean the cut on her own forehead. Lying in the dark, surrounded by the warm, animal scent of hay and horse, she listened to the rhythmic thud of Elias's axe, which had started again long after the sun had set. It sounded like a tormented heartbeat. The days that followed fell into a tense, unspoken pattern. Elias ignored them. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending a long, dilapidated fence that marked the edge of his property. His movements economical and precise. He was a man who had declared war on stillness. Lena, in turn, refused to be idle. She found a broom and swept the barn until it was spotless. She discovered a neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin and began, with fierce determination, to pull weeds and turn the soil with her bare hands. She washed their clothes in the horse trough and laid them on bushes to dry. She was claiming a small piece of this desolate world, making a space for them through sheer force of will. The twins were her silent shadows. They never strayed far, their presence a constant, watchful pressure. They observed Elias from a distance. When he left a tool on the ground, one of them would dart out, pick it up, and place it neatly on the stump he used as a workbench. They never looked at him directly, but they saw everything. They saw the way his hands, scarred and calloused, would sometimes pause their work and clench into fists for no reason. They saw him stand before the wooden cross each evening, his head bowed, a silhouette of sorrow against the dying light. One afternoon, as Elias was wrestling with a stubborn fence post, he felt a small presence beside him. It was Samuel. The boy held out a hammer. Elias hadn't even realized he'd set it down a few feet away. He stared at the small hand, the proffered tool. He took it without a word. The boy retreated back to the shadow of the barn. It was the first exchange. A crack in the wall of ice. That evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began to howl, ripping at the lonely cabin. The temperature plummeted. Elias stood on the porch, watching the first flakes of snow, thick and wet, begin to fall. He looked toward the barn. He could not leave them out there. Not in this. Cursing himself, his weakness, his dead wife's gentle ghost, he strode to the barn door and threw it open. Lena and the boys were huddled together under the blankets, their breath misting in the frigid air. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice sharp against the wind. Now Lena didn't argue. She gathered the boys and hurried them across the churning yard to the cabin. The inside was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire already crackling within its hearth, casting dancing shadows. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. Nothing more. It was a room stripped to the essentials of survival. Elias gestured to the floor by the fire. There he threw 2 more blankets down. He didn't offer the bed. That was his. But the fire was a gift of life. They spent the next 3 days trapped by the blizzard. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white. The silence inside the cabin was just as dense. It was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. On the second day, Lena, unable to bear the inaction, found a sack of flour and a tin of dried beans. She began to cook. The smell of baking bread slowly filled the small space, a scent of home and normalcy that felt alien and achingly familiar. She served him a bowl of bean stew and a piece of bread. He ate it at the table, his back to them. But he ate it all. The boys, thawed by the constant warmth of the fire, began to explore the single room with their eyes. David's gaze fell upon a small, crudely carved wooden horse on the mantelpiece. His paint was faded, one leg chipped. Elias saw him looking. "It was my son's," he said, the words costing him more than he could explain. He didn't look at them. He looked into the fire at memories only he could see. His name was Joshua. It was the first piece of himself he had offered. Lena's breath caught. She looked at her own sons, safe for the moment, and a wave of empathy washed over her, so powerful it was dizzying. She understood the fence mending, the endless chopping, the war against stillness. He was trying to outrun a silence louder than any storm. "I'm sorry," she whispered to his back. He gave a slight, sharp nod, an acknowledgement that the wall between them had been breached. The storm broke on the fourth morning. The world was pristine, buried under a thick blanket of white, the silence absolute. Elias went out to dig a path to the barn. A few minutes later, Lena came out, armed with the hearth shovel. She began to help. The boys followed, using pieces of bark to push the snow, their movements mimicking the adults. They worked together, for figures in a vast wilderness of white, carving out a space to live. The fence was their next project. The storm had knocked down another section. This time, when Elias went to fix it, Lena followed. The boys trailed behind. He showed her how to stretch the wire taut while he hammered the staples. She learned quickly, her hands sure and capable. Samuel and David would gather the fallen staples, their small fingers picking them from the snow, and place them in his coat pocket. They were a team. They didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. The mended fence was their conversation. It was a bulwark against the wild, a line drawn in the snow, a shared act of creation. One evening, sitting by the fire, Lena noticed a long, jagged scar on Elias's forearm, pale against his tan skin. "The war?" she asked softly. He traced its path with a finger. "Shiloh," he said, nothing more. But she had a scar too on her soul from a different kind of war. They understood each other in that moment, a quiet communion of survivors. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt under a strengthening sun. A fragile green pushed through the muddy earth. The twins started to make sounds. Not words, but humming. Soft, tuneless melodies they shared between them as they sat on the porch steps, whittling sticks with a small knife Elias had given them. The humming was a sign of returning life, like the first shoots of spring. Lena felt a dangerous seed of hope take root in her chest. She watched Elias with the boys, saw the way his harsh edges were softening. He'd carved a second, smaller horse, and now David and Samuel had one each. They would race them on the floorboards by the fire. Sometimes, a ghost of a smile would touch Elias's lips. It was a fragile piece, a found family, stitched together from the remnants of broken lives. But the world had a long memory. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. Not a weary traveler, but a man riding with purpose. As he drew closer, Lena's blood ran cold. It was Silas, and he was not alone. Two other men, hard-faced and carrying rifles, rode with him. Lena grabbed the boys, pulling them behind her, her body a shield. "Inside," she hissed. Elias had seen them too. He straightened up from the fence post he was setting, his face becoming a granite mask. The weary solitude was gone, replaced by something older and far more dangerous. The soldier he had tried to bury was stirring. "Lena," he said, his voice low and calm. "Get in the cabin. Bar the door. Keep the boys away from the window." She didn't hesitate. She herded the twins inside, her heart pounding against her ribs. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, her hands shaking. Through a crack in the shutters, she watched. Silas and his men reined in their horses a dozen yards from Elias. "We're looking for a woman and two whelps," Silas called out, his voice slick with arrogance. "Thieves. Stole from me. You seen hermit?" Elias didn't answer. He simply stood there, his hand resting on the heavy hammer he'd been using. "I know they're here," Silas sneered, his gaze sweeping over the tidy cabin, the repaired fence. "This place has a woman's touch all over it. Send her out. We'll be on our way." Elias's voice, when it came, was flat and cold as a river stone. "This is my land. You're not welcome here. Turn around." One of Silas's men laughed, a short, ugly bark. He raised his rifle. "He wants to be difficult." In that instant, Elias moved. He wasn't a farmer anymore. He was a whirlwind of calculated violence. He threw the hammer with deadly accuracy. It spun through the air and struck the laughing man in the chest, knocking him from his saddle with a sickening crunch. Before the others could react, Elias had snatched the axe from the chopping block. Silas, his face a mask of shock and rage, fired his pistol. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Elias's feet. The second hired man was leveling his rifle, but Elias was already closing the distance, a terrifying specter of vengeance. He moved with a brutal grace, the axe a gleaming extension of his arm. The fight was short, nasty, and absolute. It wasn't a brawl. It was an execution. When the terrible silence fell again, Elias stood breathing heavily in the muddy yard, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle. Silas was on the ground, groaning, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. His men were still. Elias walked over to Silas, the axe held loosely at his side, dripping red onto the new spring grass. He looked down at the man who had brought his past chasing after him, who had threatened to shatter the fragile peace he'd found. Inside the cabin, Lena held the boys tight. They had seen it all through the crack in the wood. They were trembling, but their eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with a fierce, terrible awe. As Elias stood over the whimpering Silas, a sound came from the cabin. The door creaked open. David stepped out onto the porch. He looked at the carnage in the yard, then at the towering figure of Elias. He took a breath. "Elias," he said. The word was clear, strong, and perfectly formed. It was the first word he had spoken in months. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was a claim, a statement. Elias turned, his expression unreadable. He saw the boy on the porch. He saw Lena in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes resolute. He saw Samuel step out to stand beside his brother. The broken man on the ground meant nothing. The violence meant nothing. All that mattered were the three figures by the cabin. He had fought not for revenge or hatred, but for them. He had defended his fence. He had defended his home. He dropped the axe. He walked past the groaning Silas without a second glance and went to his family. He knelt in the mud before the twins, his hands still trembling from the fight. He looked at David, then at Samuel. Lena came and stood behind her sons, her hand coming to rest on Elias's shoulder. Her touch was not hesitant. It was a firm, steady pressure. An anchor. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, painting the mended fence in hues of gold and orange. The fire inside the cabin glowed, a warm and waiting heart. They stood there for a long time, a silent, scarred quartet, their vigil a testament to the family they had forged in the crucible of silence and survival. The past was buried, at last, along with the men who had tried to drag it into their future.